Welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I am speaking with Jennifer Blanchard. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me here on the summit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're a screenwriter, an author, a coach, you do all sorts of things, but one of your various passions is story structure. So that's what we're going to dig into today.
Yes. It is such a nerd thing to do, but I love I love story structure.
This is a Writers Craft Summit. This is all about nerding out
Yeah.
on the little details of things like story structure. So you are in the right place.
Yes.
Maybe let us know a little bit about how does story structure come into your life and the role it's played in your development as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote my first novel in 2008. That was kind of a goal that I had had most of my life. And in January every year from like, I can't even remember, from such a long time ago, I was always like, this is the year I'm going to write my novel. And never happened. I never did it. I would start things and then not finish them. And so in 2008, I was like, okay, I'm turning 25 this year. It's time to actually do the thing I keep saying I'm going to do. And so I just said, it's happening. I'm going to have it done by my birthday that year. And, that was kind of the commitment that I made. And then a few months in, it was like not working. I wasn't doing it. I wasn't motivated. And so I started a blog to help motivate me and to write about my journey and all of that. And then along the way, I ended up hiring a writing coach to sort of hold me accountable and help me to actually finish what I said I was going to do. And so about 2 weeks before my birthday, I finished the first draft of the novel. I was just absolutely thrilled, so excited that I was like, I finally did the thing that I said I was going to do. But then reality set in and I realized like, this story sucks. I didn't know what was missing, but I couldn't make it work. Like there were so many things where it just didn't feel like a story. There was something that just was missing and I didn't know what it was. And so I was trying to revise it, going back and forth a bunch of times, and I just couldn't figure it out. It was like, okay, there's something missing. I don't know what it is. So I set it aside and decided there was more I had to learn, apparently, because I just didn't know why I couldn't fix the story, like why I couldn't make it work. And so probably like 6 months after that, early 2009, I came across a guest post on someone else's website. It was written by author Larry Brooks. He's a best-selling author. He used to be a screenwriter. He is a novelist now, and he is absolutely amazing. And the article was all about story structure. And I remember, like, I literally remember this moment where I read this article and I was sitting on the couch in my living room, and I just remember, like, it felt like the sky opened up or something. It was like, trumpets and like angels. It was like, oh my God, this moment of like, this is what's been missing. Like, this is why all the stories I've tried to write up until this point didn't work. And it made everything so clear to me. Like, this is why I struggled for so long with writing a story, because I didn't understand there's a specific framework and principles that have to be in the story in order for it to actually be a story. And so from that moment, I really like, and this is so sad, but I divide my life literally from that moment where it was like before story structure and after, because without that, I would not be the storyteller and the writer that I am today, the coach, the teacher, all of that. So it really made that big of a difference in my life. And then also, it just allowed me to teach it to other people. So I just sort of in that moment decided, number one, I'm going to master story structure. I'm going to figure it out somehow. I'm going to learn how to use it in my own stories. And two, I'm going to share this with other writers because no one was talking about it really at the time. So, at that point, Larry was the only person I'd come across who was actually talking about it, or at least in a way that made sense to me, that was clear enough where I was like, oh, I can understand this. I can use this. And so I just committed to constantly talking about his work, sharing it with other people. He had a book come out about a year later, and I literally still to this day send that book to writers when they say I'm writing a novel. I go on Amazon, I'm like, here, you need this, go get it. Like, because it's just that important. So anyway, that was sort of my journey with it. But that was really just the beginning. So I spent 5 years, like literally every single day, 2 to 3 movies a day I was watching and trying to find the plot points and trying to deconstruct them. I was working with Larry as like a client. I was actually sending him stuff to give me feedback, and he was really helping me to learn this stuff. I was devouring his books like crazy, just over and over again. I just kept rereading them and trying to understand this, and really teaching it and talking about it to other people helped me to understand it even more, because it was like every day I was having to explain it and talk about it. And so I got this like deeper understanding of it, which just made it easier for me to use it on my own stories. So Finally, in 2015, I published my very first novel, which I know would not exist without story structure. So that was kind of my journey with it. And now, like you said, I'm a screenwriter. I haven't been doing much novel stuff over the last couple of years because I've realized that screenwriting is my true love and my passion as far as writing goes. And so over the last year and a half, I've written 2.5 screenplays. I'm on my third one right now. And yeah, and actually one of the coolest things was that I submitted to a contest and I actually made it all the way to semifinalist, which was insane, so cool. But I, again, attribute that to the story structure. And if I hadn't learned all of that, I definitely would never be where I'm at right now. So yeah, story structure completely changed my life, completely changed my writing and my ability to tell a story. So that's why I'm so passionate about it and just sharing it with other writers.
I love what you say there about how learning story structure doesn't just allow you to tell a story that works, but it actually makes the process of writing
Yes.
easier,
Oh
right?
my
I mean,
gosh,
I
so
think
much easier.
that's why learning craft is such this eye-opening transition point for people, right? It's because you go from this belief that writing is staring off into space and waiting for beautiful ideas to just emerge from the
Right.
ether, and then getting frustrated when it doesn't happen. And then when you make that shift to go, oh, there is a craft here, there is a skill set, there's a framework I can work within, and all that magical, amazing, creative thing still happens, but I create a framework that
Yeah.
allows it to happen.
And I really think I honestly think that's easier because like a lot of times to me it's super intimidating to think I'm going to sit down to a blank page and write a story. Like that's super intimidating and I think that's why most writers avoid it. They procrastinate or they get halfway in and they end up stopping because they didn't do enough pre-work. Like storytelling requires pre-work. It requires some planning to really think about this stuff ahead of time. And I'm actually doing a workshop right now where we're going through my story planning process and we're about 6 weeks in now and I was saying to them today like isn't it crazy that all the stuff you've learned over the last 6 weeks that anyone would think it's a possibility to just sit down and start writing like without even thinking about this stuff like it's crazy to me now and the way and again I used to do that so like when I look back I think no wonder it never worked because that's a crazy like that is so crazy to think you can just sit down and write a story like now that's of course if you don't already know this stuff now I feel like I've done enough structuring and all that where maybe I could sit down and write a story but I wouldn't like that's the thing I wouldn't. I always pre-plan everything. I get all my scenes, my structure, like all of that. But there are writers who, like Stephen King, and he sort of gives advice like, oh, you can just sit down and start writing. Well, that's good advice for him because he has an inherent knowledge of this stuff. But for most writers, that's really bad advice because they don't have that. And so they sit down thinking, oh, I'm just going to do what Stephen King does. But it doesn't work for them because they don't have that same knowledge and skill set that he has. So for me, story planning is absolutely more important almost than any other part of the process because then not only does it make it easier to write the first draft but then you actually know what you have to do when you sit down every day and you're not like what do I do now so for me the procrastination that I used to have and really the name of the blog I started when I was writing my first novel was called Procrastinating Writers like that's how bad I used to be with it it's gone now like I literally don't procrastinate on my writing anymore because now I have what I need to actually sit down and write. So every day I get excited, like, oh, I get to write that scene today, or I get to write the next section of the story. And I don't want to avoid it. I'm excited to actually get to sit down and write it and see how it comes out versus before when I didn't know any of this stuff. And I would think, oh, I have to sit down to a blank page now and write this story, which was just so impossible for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing that one of the many things that structure gives you is the ability to say, you don't have to sit there and go, what is going to happen next in my story? You say, what needs to happen next? What is supposed to happen next? If I know where I am in this story, I know generally the types of things that should be happening and what I should be building up to or looking forward to.
Yeah, and I also think it makes you more creative because like people think, "Oh, structure is too limiting. It's a formula. It's like I don't want to do that." But really, it makes you more creative because now you've got this framework where it's like, "Okay, this is what makes it a story." And now you get to be creative and how can I work within this framework to bring this story to life as opposed to I'm just going to do whatever I want. And I kind of like think about it like with my dogs. Like if I let my dog just go out to go potty by himself or whatever. Like he'll just run around forever trying to find a spot. But if he's on a leash, he has this framework of like, okay, this is how much space I have and this is what I have to work within. And then he goes faster. And it's kind of a weird analogy, but in some ways it's the same thing where it's like, you can either just look at a blank page and think, I'm just going to do whatever, or you have this framework, which now makes you more creative because you're forced to work within these the confines of what it is actually a story, which is the structure. So to me, it's made me more creative because now I'm like, okay, how can I execute this in a way that's different, that's interesting, but that still falls in line with the principles of storytelling?
And I think this idea of rejecting a formula or a template or whatever, it feels like this kind of attitude really only exists in like fiction writing. If you look at music, it's like no one says like, oh, the blues, I'm not going to learn the blues, that's a template. Like,
Well,
it's understood you're going to learn chords and keys and you're going to pick a genre and then you're going to follow the template of that genre of music. But of course, people have been playing the blues or punk or pop music for 100 years, and everyone has their own unique take on it. That's what makes it magical.
yeah. And the other thing is that it's mostly novelists that feel that way because screenwriters from day one, if they go to school for this, they learn structure from day one. It's like the core thing that they learn in screenwriting school. So like the fact that novelists reject it is kind of ridiculous to me because it's like, this is what other storytellers are doing too. It's not like it's just, oh, a thing we're trying to give you to do. Like it's all storytelling, and all the best stories out there follow this same framework. And it's not to be a formula necessarily. They're just guidelines. They're just principles that help you to make sure your story stays on track and does what a story is supposed to do. Otherwise, you end up with an episodic narrative, which is the day-to-day occurrences of a character's life that could technically go on forever because there's no true beginning, middle, and end. Versus when you have the structure, you actually create that beginning, middle, and end because now there's this journey the character goes on, which requires certain things to happen. And when they do, it brings other elements out into the story. So it's like, to me, it made so much sense when I learned it. It was just like, okay, this is what's been missing my entire life. Like all these years that I've been trying. And I started writing fiction when I was 11 years old. So from that moment until 2009, when I discovered structure, it was like, okay, now I understand why nothing ever worked. Like I get it now. And I would never, ever write a story without finding my structure first, at minimum. Like I plan out all my scenes and all that, but at minimum, my structure is always there.
Well, I know perhaps more than any other aspect of craft, story structure can be explored and understood visually. And I know you have some slides that you've prepared. So why don't we bring that up and we can show people what this looks like, this thing that we're talking about that we found so useful. This is what it actually looks like. And you can dig in here a bit, how it all works.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is explain general story structure, and this is the little cheat sheet for it. And then I actually have a movie example that I'm going to go through that breaks down the structure of the movie. And so you can use that to sort of go back, watch the movie, and then compare the structure as you go. So I found that to be the best way to understand structure is to see it visually and to have that comparison of like, okay, these are the plot points I'm looking for. And it just really helps you to learn it better. To me, that's the number one way that I've learned structure the way that I have is just movies and comparing it and all of that. So I'm going to.
And Jennifer, I got to say, I really appreciate that you designed your slide to match my Summit shirt.
And my backdrop.
we're aesthetically pleasing in addition to being educational in this session.
Just this slide. The other ones are black and white. But okay, so this is the general story structure timeline, and I'm just gonna kind of walk through it and then let me know if you have any specific questions or anything that come up as we go. Okay, so first of all, you may have seen something slightly different than this when it comes to the parts of story. So a lot of people have heard of 3-act structure, and what I'm going to show you here is 4-part structure. Now, this is exactly the same as 3-act structure. The only difference is what I'm calling stuff, and also that I've kind of nuanced the more specific pieces of that second act. So if you're used to 3-act structure, basically part 1 is going to be act 1. Parts 2 and 3 are going to be act 2, and then part 4 is going to be act 3. So other than that, it's exactly the same. And the reason I like the 4-part structure better is because it allows you to see that there is actually different contexts that have to happen in that middle section of your story in order for it to actually work. And if you don't know that, if you kind of just think, oh, act two is just one thing, then you miss that, and you actually miss the opportunity to make the story even better. So that's why I like this version. This is the version that Larry Brooks teaches and that I learned from him. And like I said, is what I live by now. So, okay. So starting off with the parts of story. So the first part of story is setup. So everything that happens in this section of your story is the setup. It's going to be setting up what's coming. It's going to be giving us hinting at stuff, foreshadowing, mentioning things that are going to happen later, etc. Then you have your part two, which is going to be the reaction. And this is when the character is reacting to what happens at your first plot point. And I'm going to explain all those as well, don't worry. Part three is the attack. So this is when your character is now attacking the problem, attacking the antagonist, doing things proactively. And then part four is your resolution. So that's when everything gets resolved. So starting in part one, we have the setup. And in part one, there are two milestones that you need to have. The first is your hook. This is happening between 1% and 5% into the story. Now, if you are writing a novel, that's going to land somewhere between 20 pages or in your first chapter. If you're writing a screenplay, your hook is usually the very first scene of the screenplay. So if you've ever seen movies, which I'm sure all of you have, you'll notice that the very first scene is always hooking us into what's coming later in the story. So it kind of is this like early hint of something coming. Now, just to mention this, the hook milestone is different than the idea of hooking your reader. So a lot of times in like fiction classes and things like that, people will say you have to hook your reader. That's true, you do. And that comes with the stuff that we're going to talk about here. But this moment is different than hooking your reader. This moment is a specific milestone that basically hints at the antagonism that's coming at the first plot point. So you're not going to tell us who the antagonist is. You're not going to give anything away specifically, but you are going to hint that there's something else going on. And that is there because part one is usually just showing us where the character is in their life before anything happens. So your protagonist is just living their everyday life. They're kind of going through their day-to-day stuff. And as this is happening, we get this hook moment early on that lets us know like, hey, something is coming. This character is about to have something hit them. They're going to have something that they're going to have to deal with. So then we get our first plot point. Our first plot point is going to end part one. It's going to transition us into part two. So it's a transition moment in the story. It happens 20 to 25% of the way into the story. If you're doing movie structure, usually it's right at 25. Sometimes it's slightly earlier, but usually for movie structure, it's dead on 25. But if you're doing a novel, you have that range, 20 to 25%. Your first plot point moment is going to be the introduction of your antagonist. So you're going to introduce the antagonist, what their goal is. So obviously your protagonist has a goal in the story. Your antagonist is going to have a goal that directly opposes the protagonist's goal. And so because of that, now we have an actual story. So that gets introduced at your first plot point. We also know what's at stake personally for your protagonist, which is a big deal. And then we also have meaning. So there may have been things that were shown in the setup phase. So maybe some hints at stuff or some, a little bit of antagonism that was kind of being shown, but we weren't clear on why it was happening. Well, your first plot point explains why it's happening. It tells us what it all means. And so now this is the start of your actual story. So the first plot point is going to transition us now into part two of the story, which is reaction. Now, what that means is the character is reacting to what just happened at the first plot point, and they spend all of part two in reaction mode. So they're not ready to be proactive yet. If they try and attempt things, it fails or it doesn't work. In this part, they're really just doing things like hiding, running, laying low, trying to figure out what to do next, doing research, figuring things out. They're really in this mode of like, they're not sure what to do yet. They're getting their feet and they're grounding back in their own life at this point because the first plot point really shook them up. Now, halfway between your first plot point and your midpoint moment, which is going to be halfway into your story, you're going to have a moment called the pinch point. And there are going to be two of these in your story. Now, you could have more than one pinch point in this section if you wanted to, but you have to have at least one, and it has to be halfway between your first plot point and your midpoint. Now, your pinch point is going to just be a reminder of the antagonist and what's at stake for the protagonist. So it can be just a subtle reminder, or it can be something extreme. Every story is different, but you got to have that reminder. And this is especially important in part two, because a lot of times in part two, we don't see as much of the antagonist yet because they showed up at the first plot point and now they're sort of in the background for a little while your protagonist gathers some grounding. They're kind of figuring out things again, they're reacting. Now, this isn't true of every story. Some stories, you have the antagonist the entire time. But a lot of stories, you don't see it as much in part two. So it does depend on your genre. Then we move into our midpoint. The midpoint is going to be happening halfway into the story, so right at 50% or, around there. And this is the moment that transitions us from part 2 reaction to part 3 attack. This is why it's important to have in my mind, the 4-part structure versus the 3-act structure. Because without that, you just go, oh, this is act 2. You don't realize that there's a plot point directly in the middle and that it separates 2 contexts, one being reaction and the other being attack. So your midpoint moment is going to be a moment that gives us new information, that sort of explains something that's been happening that we didn't have a full explanation of yet, or it might introduce another antagonist if and only if the antagonist is tied into the one from the first plot point. So what you don't want is a story that has more than one antagonist. You do want to have the same antagonist going along the entire story. Now, if for some reason you have more than one, they either have to have the exact same opposing goal or they have to be working together. So sometimes you have that hierarchical antagonism where one guy is the boss and then there's minions that work for him. And in that case, you might have shown a minion at your first plot point, and then we find out who the true antagonist is at the midpoint. So that's just sort of a moment where you introduce new information. It's something that shifts the direction of the story. So where the character was reacting before, now they have information that's going to make them proactive. And that's why I completely believe in the 4-part structure, because without knowing that, it could ruin the whole story. And really the biggest thing that writers tell me they have trouble with is the middle part of their story. They're always like, oh, I know what to do in the beginning and the end, but the middle is always so confusing to me. Well, this is why, because you didn't realize that there are 2 different contexts and a plot point that has to happen there. So that's your midpoint. And then you're going to have part 3, which is the attack. So now your protagonist knows enough, has done enough up to this point that they can start being proactive and actually start taking action against the antagonist that works this time. Now, it's not going to work completely because we still have more of the story to go, but this is when they can start actually stepping up and actually having some success in trying to overcome this antagonist. Now, same as in part 2, we're going to have that pinch point 2 in the middle of part 3. It's going to be 50% between your midpoint and your second plot point. And it's going to be, again, just a reminder of the antagonist and what's at stake for the protagonist. So it's just that reminder moment because we have to know, hey, this guy is still here and he's getting stronger as we go. Then you have your second plot point. That's going to land between 75 and 80% of the way into the story. It is the final piece of structure that you need. And it's also the final place where new information can come into the story. So after this moment, everything has to already have been mentioned, hinted at, foreshadowed, or set up. That is including any twist ending you might be thinking about. So a huge mistake writers make with twist endings is that they just have something random come in at the end, and that doesn't work. It has to be either hinted at, set up, foreshadowed, mentioned. And the thing that I think a lot of times writers get freaked out about is like, oh, but if I hint at it or foreshadow it early, then the reader will completely know that it's coming and they'll expect it. But that doesn't happen. It's actually, when it does happen at the end, they get that moment of like, oh my gosh, it's like a realization for the reader. It's like, oh, that's why you showed us that earlier. It makes so much sense now. Versus getting to the end and you're like, what? How can that happen? That wasn't what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So twist endings still have to be set up. New information cannot happen in part 4. So after your second plot point, we're transitioned from attack to resolution. So now this is when your protagonist has all the information, knows everything they have to do, has everything that it takes to step up and defeat the bad guy. And that's when they're now going to go do that into part 4 of your story. So that is the basics of story structure. Those are the major milestones that you have to have. There are 6 of them. They are not going to be a ton of stuff happening at these moments. They're just one thing that happens. And then there's other stuff that happens around it or that leads to it. And those are your other scenes.
I also teach a 4-part structure, and I think one of the reasons the midpoint is so important, as you alluded to, why it's important to really acknowledge and point to it, is that the fact that your diagram here is like the second half mirrors the first half, that isn't a coincidence, right? Like, so much of what we're setting up in the reaction period in part 2 is then paid off in part 3. You know, the lessons the character or the skills the character learns in, say, part 2, then they get to go use in the field in part 3. And so I think that's another really great reason for using the 4-part structure and thinking about things in that manner, is because you can say to yourself, okay, the things I'm setting up in the first half of the book, I'm going to pay off in the second half.
And also, just to mention, and this, I don't put it on here because it's not technically in the structure that I've learned, it's not technically like a story milestone, but it is something you could think about because you were talking about mirroring. So you have your hook moment, which happens right, 1 to 5% in. So over here in part 4, you could also have a climax moment, which is really just that moment where your antagonist and your protagonist are going to have that final showdown. Um, I don't consider that a piece of structure necessarily, but it could be. So I've heard people talk about it as another potential like plot point. So that's something you can think about. That right here, that would be probably about 90% of the way into the story at that point. You could have that climax moment, which is really that, this is when the antagonist and the protagonist have their final showdown and we see the resolution of everything that's led up to this moment. Now, like I said, I don't put it here because it's not really, as far as a story milestone, it doesn't have to be there. Not every story has it in that way, but it's definitely an option if you want it. And then, of course, you would have that line here and it would say climax. And then, of course, it would be exactly mirrored like what you were talking about. To me, that's more of a story beat than it is a plot point milestone. So it's kind of like something you would want to think about having in here, but not necessarily something that like is required.
Whereas the other things identified here, you would really argue need to be
Right. Yeah, because they, especially your first plot point, midpoint, and second plot point, they transition us into the other parts of the story. So it's literally like the character transitioning, as well as this structure also falls in line with the character arc and how a character changes and transitions over the course of a story, which I didn't get into here, but we could definitely talk about if that's something you want to talk about. But I don't know what your other sessions are on, so I don't want to step on anyone's toes there. But yeah, so like these plot points, they transition the character through each part of the story and through their character arc as well. So that's why they're needed, because the character can't make these changes without getting certain information and knowing certain things and learning certain things to go along. So that's why it's so important to have that structure there.
perfect. Well, do you want to dig into the film that
Yeah.
you mentioned and give us some examples here of this stuff actually playing out in the story?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so this is a breakdown of the movie 47 Meters Down. I think it's available on Netflix right now. It may not be by the time this airs, but if not, you can go to Amazon and you can rent it. It's like $2 or $3 to rent it. Totally worth your time. I've probably watched this movie 15 to 20 times at this point, just because I love the structure. And like I said, I'm a super story nerd when it comes to structure. So for me, movies are so much more enjoyable when they have really good structure. And I tend to see like certain movies that people would say, yeah, I didn't really like that too much. Like I tend to love because I'm like, oh my God, but the structure was so good in that movie. So yeah, it's kind of just like my nerd hobby, but I love watching movies and breaking down story structure. So this is one that I did recently and really great movie. Highly recommend it. It's 90 minutes, 90 minutes of your time, completely worth watching. And now that you have this to use to compare it, it's going to make a huge difference in your watching ability, because now you're going to see these moments play out and start to recognize like, oh, okay, this was the setup and this was where they're reacting. And it kind of just all comes to life more that way. So for me, story deconstructions are the way that I mastered the structure, is learning, basically reading the deconstructions that Larry's done, watching the movies, doing my own deconstructions, comparing it. Like that just made a huge difference.
I think that's a really important point. I think part of learning craft is going through training sessions like this and getting the information, but then the other part is it's incumbent on you as an artist to no longer be just a consumer of art, but to be an active analyzer of it, right? Like to really see how these things play out. Because for anyone who's concerned about something being too formulaic, well, if you watch 20 movies or read 10 books and you see 10 different plot point ones, you'll see they all happen at the right moment, but they all play out
Right.
so
They all
differently.
do the same thing, but they all play out differently. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And really you can do this exact same thing with novels. I just tend to do movies more often because it's faster. So like I can deconstruct a movie in 90 minutes versus a novel I have to read multiple times, and it takes, so I did a couple of novel deconstructions that took me like 15 to 20 hours versus a movie where I can do it in a couple of views of the movie. So that's why I recommend movies. Plus the visual of it, I feel like just helps you to sort of understand it better, because you can see it playing out in front of you like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Whereas a novel, there's so much stuff being written around those plot points that you kind of can miss them sometimes because you're just sort of getting stuck in the narrative. and you kind of get pulled into the story. So so that's why I like the movie breakdowns.
I think movies are great. I use that for, this isn't a genre discussion, but when clients of mine are thinking about writing a new book and they say, well, I want to write maybe a high fantasy. I'm like, go watch 6 high fantasy movies this week. You're going to learn the tropes. You're going to learn the conventions. You're going to learn the obligatory scenes. All that stuff is going to come through. And as you said, it's a lot tougher to read 6 books in a week than it is to just go watch 6
Right.
films. And so
Yep.
from a craft perspective, from like a workman-like perspective, it's often easier to just go take a look at films to learn the stuff and see how it plays
Yeah.
out. It's just quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Okay, so let's dive into this. Okay, so the hook moment. Now, like I said, in a movie, the hook is usually the very first scene. So that's what we get here. And in fact, the hook starts right as the credits start rolling in the beginning of the movie. So we get it right away. So the hook here is that someone comes up from underneath the water. So this girl is sitting on a raft in a pool, and we see the camera angle. So this is the most important part. So someone comes up from underneath the water, underneath her raft, and then knocks her off the raft like this, spilling her into the water. And she has a drink that's on her, like, so she has a raft with like a little drink holder, and the drink spills into the water as well. Now the drink is blood red, foreshadowing, obviously. And so now that doesn't seem like anything. Like, okay, so she gets knocked off her raft, but where the hook comes in is the angle of the camera. So the camera angle is from the bottom of the ocean looking. So it's basically like looking up at the top of the water. So this is like hooking us into this moment of like, there's something coming. Like there's the beginning of the story, when they start rolling the credits, we see like the ocean floor, and we think that's where we are at first. And then we see this girl, and then suddenly when she flips off the raft, we realize she's in a pool. But the camera angle and the beginning showing us the ocean floor and then the blood in the water just gives you that hook of like, something is coming. And of course, the movie is called 47 Meters Down. So if you've seen the description of it, you know that it has to do with people being at the bottom of the ocean. So that beginning moment is the hook that really lets us know like there's something else coming. And the way the angle is, it's the angle that a shark would see a person at if they were under the water. So this is hinting at what's coming. And this is letting us know that there's more to this story than what we're about to see. And then, of course, we get right into the actual story. So we meet the 2 sisters. We learn that they're on this vacation in Mexico, and, blah, 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 and all these things that happen as they go. So we're getting that setup of the story, right? So we're getting where they're at in their life currently, what's happening in their life right now, all of that stuff. And then, of course, we're leading into moving to the next plot point, which is our first plot point. Okay, so in the setup of the story, these characters decide to go shark diving. They meet these 2 guys that they become friends with, and they decide to go shark diving together. The guys go every weekend. They're like, oh, it's so cool. We love it. It's so fun. We have this guy that we go out with, and he's really, he's got a great way of finding the sharks, and so we have such a good time. So they agree to go. So the guys go in the cage. They do their thing. They come back up. No problem. So now the girls, it's their turn to get into the shark cage. So they get into the shark cage, and everything seems fine at first. They go under the water, and they're looking at everything, and everything is, really cool, and they're excited about it, and they're taking pictures. And suddenly the winch that is holding the cage slips, and the cage slips down a few feet. And the girls are freaking out, and the captain says, don't worry, it's okay. We're going to bring you up now. No problem. Well, then you get your first, so let's sort of all set up to this moment. And then you get your first plot point. The thing snaps. The cage plummets to the bottom of the ocean. The entire, not just the hook that was like holding the cage, but the entire winch, everything falls into the water. So it's like it hooks off from the boat and like just falls right in. So now they're plunging 47 meters down to the bottom of the ocean. Boom. So now we get the beginning of the story. This is when the story actually starts. So everything that's led up to this moment was setting us up for this moment. So now these 2 girls are trapped in a shark cage, low on air at the bottom of the ocean. So obviously they're in open ocean. So it's shark infested waters. It's dark. They have no idea what's out there. What's at stake? Their lives. What's at stake? I mean, that's the biggest stake that we have here is their lives. Not only are they running out of air because they're on scuba tanks, so they only have a certain amount of air available, but now they're trapped in a shark cage, and they've got 47 meters of open ocean before they can get back to the surface. So the antagonist and antagonistic force in this story are two things. So the antagonistic force is the ocean itself. It's the idea of open ocean and the unknowns of it. And then what personifies that in the story is the sharks. So basically they're sharks that are around them that are going to attack them, obviously. So that's our first plot point. That's the introduction of our antagonist. It's introduction of what's at stake, the opposing goal. So obviously the girls, their goal is to get out alive, and the sharks want to kill them. So that's the opposing goal right there. So that moves us into part 2. Okay, now we're into part 2. So again, I'm kind of paraphrasing a lot of this because I want you guys to go watch this movie, and I don't want to ruin every little thing that happens, but I'm just going to give you the most important pieces so that you kind of know, okay, what are the structure points I'm looking for? So obviously they're in the cage, they're reacting, trying to figure out what to do now. They're trying to make contact with the guys, but because of how far they are, they can't reach the boat. It's too far. It's breaking the communication between their scuba gear and the people on the boat. So one of the sisters decides to get out of the shark cage, swim up so that she can make contact with the boat. So basically she's put herself out in open ocean in the dark and has no idea what's going to happen. So she goes up, she makes contact with the captain and basically tells him, we're okay, we're alive, we're at the bottom of the ocean right now, like we don't know what to do, we're freaking out. And he tells her, get back in the shark cage, it's the only safe place from the sharks. No matter what you do, don't come out and don't try to swim straight up or you'll get the bends and you'll die. So basically reminding us of the antagonist, the sharks, the fact that if they don't stay in the cage, they're not going to be safe. And then of course, what's at stake? Their lives. Just giving us that reminder. Okay, now we move along to our midpoint. So at this point, they're just reacting. They're hanging out in the cage. They're talking to each other. They're telling stories to each other. They're just trying to keep their morale up. And they're noticing that their tanks are starting to get really low on air. So it's becoming a very dire situation. So then we get our midpoint. So the captain tells them, and this is in the part 2 of the story, he tells them that he's going to send one of his assistants down to basically bring another cable. They're going to hook up to the boat and they're going to pull them back up. So they're waiting. That's basically what they're doing at this point until we get to the midpoint. In part 2, they're just waiting. They're trying to wait for this guy to show up to help them. So in the midpoint, the girls see the guy's flashlight in the water. So they know that he's come to rescue them. They know he has another cable that they're going to connect to the boat and it's going to get them back to where they want to go. So that's the midpoint. It's that moment of new hope, new direction. Okay, this guy's here. He's going to rescue us. We're good. But then we get into part 3 and we realize, wait a second, he's not showing up. We see the flashlight, but nothing's happening. And so one of the sisters makes the decision that she's going to go out, swim out into the open ocean in the dark and try to find this guy. Basically, she's going to swim toward his flashlight and try to find him. So this is now the difference between them sitting in the cage reacting versus she's being proactive now. Okay, I see him. He's here. I have to help him out. I have to help him find us. So she gets out of the cage and she's taking proactive action. So again, this is why it's super important to know that there are 2 contexts in the middle of the story. Because if you don't know that, you would just have them possibly reacting the whole time or possibly taking action the whole time, and that doesn't work. They have to build up to that. They have to build up the courage, the knowledge, the whatever they need in the story in order to take action. So they've done that. So they are tired of waiting. One of the girls' tanks is so low that she's pretty much going to be out of air soon, and the other one just happens to have a little bit more than she does. So she makes the decision to go out and find this guy. And that's her moving into part 3. Okay, pinch point 2. So she finds the guy. Unfortunately, he gets killed by a shark. And so she has to do this herself. And I'm sorry, I'm giving away some of the story, I know, but unfortunately I can't really explain all this without explaining some of what happens. But I won't give away the ending, I promise. Okay, so
they might have been able to guess that some people were going to get eaten by the sharks.
Some people are going to get eaten by sharks. It's kind of how it goes. Not everybody can survive. But as long as your main characters do right, that's the whole point. So we'll see if they do or not when you watch the movie. Okay, so she finds the guy. He gets eaten by a shark, but he has the other cable attached to his belt. So she disconnects it. She is able to disconnect it from his belt. She brings it back to the cage. She goes up, tells the captain, she swims up enough that she can communicate to him. And she says, hey, we've connected it to the cage. We're ready to come up now. And he says, okay. So she goes back into the shark cage. So we get our pinch point 2 now. He's raising the shark cage up. They're moving up. They're going up and up and up. And it has to happen slowly because if they don't do it slowly, they're going to get the bends. So he has to bring them up a certain amount of feet, and then they have to wait, and then they can go up again. So it's sort of like a process. Well, as he's doing this, the second cable breaks, snaps off the cage, and now they plunge back down to the bottom of the ocean. But this time when they do, the cage tips on its side and it lands on top of the protagonist's leg, trapping her under the cage. So now they're in a worse off situation than they were before, because not only is she trapped, but she's bleeding. So as we all know, blood in the water attracts sharks, obviously. So here we've got that reminder of what's at stake, their lives. We got the reminder of the fact that they're trapped in the open ocean, and of course that the sharks are surrounding them, and now she's bleeding. So we've got a very strong reminder of our antagonist right here. And then we have our second plot point. So obviously she's stuck under the shark cage, so the other sister, who doesn't have as much air, has to now start to take a little bit more action. So she goes up, makes contact with the captain again, tells him we're still okay, but Lisa's stuck under the cage and we need help. She's bleeding, etc. And he tells her, we've got the Coast Guard on the way. They're going to come and rescue you guys. You just have to sit tight. They're on their way. And he says, get back in the cage. I'm going to send down 2 extra tanks of air. So, okay, they know that this is happening. One other thing that happens here is that he tells them, just be careful, because if you are on a second tank of air, there's a good chance you could start hallucinating. So you have to watch each other very closely. And this isn't part of the second plot point, but this is something he mentions to her. This is kind of like part of part 3. And this is important because there is stuff that's going to happen from that moment because of that. So the second plot point is basically the other sister, she comes back down, and as she's coming down, the tanks have fallen down, so she goes out to grab them, and she gets attacked by a shark. So she has to lay low. She has to sort of hide out, wait until the coast is clear, basically. Well, as she's doing that, the shark basically attacks her. So we don't know what happens to her at this point. We're not sure. We just know that that's happened. So now Lisa, the one who's still in the cage and trapped, her leg is stuck, she has to find a way to get that second tank of air or she's going to die. So the second plot point is when she finally is able to somehow, and she does a bunch of tricky little things, she pulls the tank close to her. And basically right before this moment, we have something called the all hope is lost lull. And that's basically when you think the character is done for, she's screwed over, this is never going to happen, she's gone. And this happens in most movies, right before your second plot point. You get this moment of like, oh my God, the antagonist is going to win. And this happens in most movies, like I said, not all of them, but most of them. And then you get the second plot point, which is basically new hope. It's new direction for the story. It's an opportunity for this character to have another chance, basically. So the second plot point here is when she gets a hold of the tank, she pulls it over to her and she reconnects her scuba gear. So now she can breathe again. And now she's got the opportunity to do something because now she's got a full tank of air and she can basically, okay, now I've got enough air to breathe that I can pull myself underneath the tank or underneath the cage, etc. So I'm not going to tell you what happens from here, but that is the second plot point in the story. So it's that moment of like new hope, new direction, and hopefully her being able to rescue her and the sister. So that is the plot points in the 47 Meters Down movie, and I hope you guys go watch it because it's an amazing movie. It's only 90 minutes, so it won't take up that much of your time, but it will be a great study and story for you.
That was fantastic, Jennifer. I felt like I got an education on story structure, and then I also felt like I experienced an awesome movie via the narration there. So that was fantastic.
Go watch it because it's a great movie. It's. I mean, again, like I said, it's 90 minutes. So if you didn't like it, you learned something, and it's only 90 minutes.
Well, as we come to a conclusion here, any final thoughts on story structure? Anything you want to leave people with in terms of how structure can play out in the development of their writing and of their writer's craft?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is if you haven't already read the book Story Engineering by Larry Brooks, go get a copy of that book right now and go read it, because that book not only explains story structure like I've done, but it explains all these other elements that you want to have in your story as well. And to me, there you go, Story Engineering. To me, that is the only book on writing you ever really need to read. Now, it's not to say you can't read other books, because you definitely can, and maybe even should if you just want more information. But to me, if you have that book, you have everything that you need to write a really good story. So go get a copy of that right now. Other than that, I would say just be patient with yourself, because story structure is not something you're going to master overnight. It's not something that you're going to learn the first time you do it. It took me, like I said, 5 years. And this is no joke. Every day I was watching movies and deconstructing them as much as I could. Some days it was 2 movies or 3 movies if I had enough time, because I was that passionate about learning structure and being able to implement it in my own stories. And so at first, so the first 4 years, I couldn't identify plot points in a movie. It was like, I don't know where they are. I don't know why I can't figure this out. It's so frustrating to me. But as I just kept doing it, kept working on it, kept studying it and practicing and really just doing this, one day they just started showing up to me. And suddenly it was like, oh my God, how did I never see this before? And Larry always told me that would happen. So in 2009, when I met him, he told me, one day, if you keep this up, the plot points are just going to jump off the screen at you and hit you in the face. Like every time you're just going to see it and you're never going to be able to unsee it when that happens. And so I just kept waiting for that to happen. I was like, okay, Larry said it's going to happen. I believe him. Like, I'm just going to keep doing this. And one day it did. So one day I just remember the day before, I couldn't have identified the first plot point to save my life. And the next day it was like, how did I never see this before? And now I see it all the time. It's literally like impossible for me to not notice. In fact, I would annoy people that I go see movies with because I'll literally lean over and be like, that's the first plot point. And it's like, they don't care. They just want to watch the movie. But here I'm like, that's the first plot point. I know what it is now. I can recognize it. I can pick it out. And it made a huge difference in my storytelling and in how I view movies and books, because now I can pick up on why certain things are happening and why they're happening, where they're happening, and why the things are happening the way that they are. So just be patient with yourself. Don't give up if you're not figuring it out right away. Just keep watching movies, keep studying story. And the more that you do that and really commit yourself to it, eventually you're going to get to a place where it's like second nature to you. And once that happens, it's going to change everything. So that's what I would say is just, keep going. And also recognize that storytelling is one of those things you never really master, because there's always something more you can learn. There's always a new level of understanding you can get to. So even with where I'm at right now, I still learn stuff all the time. I watch movies and I think, oh, what a cool way to execute that plot point, or like, what a cool way. And it's just commit to being a lifelong student of story, because that's really what you have to be if you want to be a really good storyteller and a really good writer, and to actually have a career doing this stuff.
At the very beginning of this talk, you mentioned how learning structure was a transformative moment in your life. And I bet someone out there watching this summit video right now is going through that same experience. I really hope this summit and this presentation will be that for someone else. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on here to put together this amazing presentation, because I know there's someone out there whose life is going to be changed by the information you just shared. So
Yeah,
thank you so much, Jennifer.
you are so welcome. Light bulb moment, right? You just get it now.